Well, welcome everyone to WATAC Presents Recontextualising Scripture in Theory and Practice with guest associate Professor Robyn and Dr. Teresa Brown, who are going to guide us through a process of recontextualisation of Scripture. I'm Danielle Lynch, Secretary of WATAC, and your host for this session. WATAC Presents is a project of Women and the Australian Church, an incorporated organisation that commenced in 1984 to promote women's role in the Australian Church. We're Catholic in origin, ecumenical in practice, and inclusive in our membership. Welcome to WATAC Presents. I come to you from the lands of my ancestors, the English, today, so apologies if the internet is a little glitchy, but this meeting is being held on Aboriginal lands across Australia. We respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and future. We acknowledge their stories, traditions, and living cultures. And we commit to building a brighter future together. I invite you to name into the chat the people on whose lands you are today. WATAC are committed to making this event accessible and productive for everyone. James, if you could share the slide now, that would be excellent. We won't tolerate harassment in any form, and we invite you to be constructive in any questions and discussions you have. During the course of our discussions, you might raise difficult questions, though we're dealing with scripture today, so perhaps not so many. And it's important that you feel safe, and if you feel at any time you need to take a break, you're welcome to leave and come back. So Zoom meetings are public spaces, and we suggest that you take care when you speak about your own experience. There are some support mechanisms on the screen. WATAC's not a space that can support disclosures, but there will be some WATAC members that stick around at the end if anyone wants to have a conversation. So for today's WATAC Presents, Teresa and Robyn are going to include the prayer in part of their presentation. So I'll introduce them and hand over to them. Robyn is a teaching and research academic at the Australian Catholic University. In her research, she uses the work of contemporary philosophers to re-articulate concepts like grace, sin, and revelation, because the task of the theologian is to recontextualize beliefs so they're meaningful for each generation. She collaborates with theologians at KU Leuven to promote understanding of theological foundations of the Enhancing Catholic School Identity Project and to help form leaders and teachers to enhance Catholic identity. She's worked on many books, and she's the author of Jean-Luc Marion, Rethinking God as Gift and Experience of God. Dr. Teresa Brown is a theologian and teacher also working at the Australian Catholic University. Her PhD explored the relationship between Trinitarian faith and Christian life through the lens of Liebenberger's theology of interruption. In her PhD, she asked the question, how does a theology of interruption help us to think God today? She also works on Catholic school identity, undertaking work with Robyn in partnership with KU Leuven and Catholic education systems all around Australia. The teaching and research that Teresa and Robyn have undertaken together have been the inspiration for their forthcoming book, Recontextualising in Theory and Practice. And we're going to get a little snippet of some of their work today. So Teresa, Robyn, over to you.
Thanks, Danielle. And you really are going to get just a little snippet because we're going to do something reflective and meta-reflective at the same time. So you'll need to be a bit split. But first we're going to pray, and we're going to do Lectio Divina in a shortened form. And we're going to listen to the gospel of today. What I'd like you to do as you listen is just to allow the words to flow over you. And if any of the words strike you, to just make a note of that word or words. They might not be things that would otherwise seem important. Just place yourself in the presence of God and allow the scripture to unfold. So Teresa's going to read from Matthew 26, 14 to 25.
Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. As you reflect on this passage, think of this question. What does it feel like to be Judas?
I'm going to read a passage from a text that's called "Judas, the Most Hated Name in History." On a crisp afternoon, the small, strung-out Dorset village of Moreton is dozing under a blanket of autumnal leaves in red, gold and caramel. Tucked away in the lanes between Dorchester and the sea, it appears at first glance an unlikely place to have got itself into a tangle over Judas. But controversy there certainly was here, sufficient to make headlines, and it took place not 500 years ago, as is usually the way with these once notorious sites of religious disputes in the English countryside, but in the last decade of the 20th century. Judas still has the power to divide communities. The battleground was the local parish church. It is certainly well signposted from the village green, if absent from the skyline. St. Nicholas's Church is dedicated to a 4th century Syrian bishop who, Christian legend holds, was the model for Father Christmas. In October 1940, the building took an almost direct hit from a German bomb. A great hole was blown in the north wall, and all 12 of its stained glass windows were shattered beyond repair. With local enthusiasm, and a grant from a post-war reconstruction fund, however, St. Nicholas's was restored and reconsecrated 10 years later. The basic shape and design remained the same, but in place of the traditional reds, blues and greens of the old 19th century windows, it now featured 5 strikingly original, many say unique, clear sheets, engraved by the artist Sir Lawrence Whistler. After the initial 5, he added to their number up until 1984, when all 12 spaces were filled, linked by the theme of light, physical and spiritual. Then in the late 1980s, Sir Lawrence offered St. Nicholas's the gift of a 13th window of Judas Iscariot. It had originally been made for a joint exhibition he had staged with his son. Though the parish council originally welcomed the gift, some 44 churchgoers, backed by their vicar, subsequently wrote in to object. Deadlock resulted and dragged on for several years until the fate of the gift was referred up to the local diocese, where again, after initially positive reactions, Sir Lawrence's offer was declined. A world-renowned artist, being snubbed by the church where his 12 existing windows drew in visitors from all around the globe, became news. The reasons given by the objectors were various. That the depiction of Judas hanging by the neck was too graphic. Hanging is not a very comely thing, the artist replied dryly. That his dress was too modern, jeans, jumper and Wellingtons for such an historic church. That the traitor of the Gospels had nothing to do with the linking theme of light found in the other windows. Some, though, seemed simply to have been displaying that 2,000-year-old antipathy to Judas. They didn't want the traitor to darken the door or lighten the windows of their church. A compromise was agreed with the artist, whereby the window was placed on indefinite loan by the church to the County Museum in Dorchester. And there it remained for 20 years, displayed in a simple wooden frame until 2013, when a new incumbent at St. Nicholas, the Reverend Jackie Birdseye, hoped that attitudes had changed sufficiently for Judas to be allowed into the church. This time there was unanimity in favour when she raised the matter, and in the summer of that year, the window was fully installed, albeit with no ceremony for fear of reigniting debate. The sun is low in the sky as I step inside St. Nicholas's. I'm still puzzling whether, while being awestruck by Sir Lawrence's technical skill, I actually like the result. When I realise that I still haven't spotted the 13th window that has brought me here. There's no trace of Judas. I retreat to the porch, where I find a telephone number for the Reverend Birdseye. I'm looking for Judas, I explain. Ah, she explains, you need to go outside to see it. We're back to Judas the outsider. He may have been allowed back to St. Nicholas after a 2-decade exile, but not inside the body of the church. He's been allotted a blind window at the back, overlooking a plot of grapes. It is glazed, but immediately behind it is black wooden boarding, so it can't be seen from the pews. Judas, it seems, still causes sufficient embarrassment for the worshippers at St. Nicholas for him to be accorded any special treatment. They have put him in the most obscure place they can think of. It makes for a neat metaphor about Judas's current standing in the world, widely known, often spoken of. No longer perhaps such a pariah, but still handled with caution. But that may be to judge the parishioners of St. Nicholas's too harshly. Having already filled all 12 available window spaces inside the church, Sir Lawrence would have known that the only possible other location for his depiction of Judas was here. The most striking feature of the window, though, is the light that streams down from the heavens and onto Judas as he dies. Contrary to those objections from parishioners, it connects this panel with the theme that unites all the others inside the church. Judas no longer has about him something of the night. Even the worst sinner, if that is indeed what he was, can be saved by God's light. It makes for a tender scene. Sir Lawrence called it the forgiveness window. He intended his Judas, he said, to be timeless and relevant to any age and to ordinary people. I invite you to take another moment just to reflect and make a few notes as you think about the person of Judas and where you find yourself in relation to Judas. And if I could have everyone back on the screen, please. I'll explain what we would normally do, which is what we're not doing with you, that we wish we could do. Because this process normally takes us an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. Teresa and I have been working on the concept of recontextualisation, which actually comes from literary studies and talks about putting something in a new context. In the theological sense, we talk about recontextualising beliefs in the sense that they begin to have a conversation with the contemporary world. And we work a lot with teachers in performing recontextualisations. But often people ask us, well, how would you do a recontextualisation? So we developed a 4-stage pattern. It's not the way to do recontextualisation, it's just a way that we've thought about doing it. Teresa, you might want to put that slide up perhaps. And the first stage is what we've been doing with you tonight, except that we'd take a lot longer to do it, of course, and we'd get you to talk about it, is listening to the text in a number of different ways. So sometimes that might mean doing Lectio Divina. Sometimes it might mean listening to different renderings of the same text. With children, it might be listening to the text and then enacting the text with the children taking different roles and speaking about how they feel when they take different roles, doing something called bibliodrama, and so on. So there's no right way to listen to the text. Tonight, we invited you to do a very quick reflection in Lectio Divina on the text. And then we brought some reflection on the text from a contemporary writer. In doing that, we moved to our second stage, which is to dialogue, which normally we'd do with the biblical tradition. So we'd have a look at how the text had been understood in its contemporary of the time context, and then how it's been understood through history, especially by the church. And then looking at the text within the current context and asking how the text might speak to the current context. And we do that in a dialogical way so that we don't require that the text speaks to a Christian context, but we allow people to enter into dialogue with the text from wherever they stand. So tonight, we did a bit of a Swiftie in the sense that we brought this contemporary text, which had some of the history of the church's responses to Judas in it, but also was something of a dialogue with the contemporary context and the ways in which we engage with church and how we might engage with Judas. The third step is the performance of a recontextualisation. That is, after reflecting on the biblical tradition, post-biblical tradition and the current context, we draw out some of the ways in which the text is speaking to different people in the group. That's what we're going to ask you to do in a moment. And normally, we would then record that recontextualisation, perhaps in text, perhaps in art, perhaps in music, in some way, making some kind of record of the ways in which the text has struck us. And then the fourth step is to evaluate whether we've been respectful of the text, whether we've been respectful of the context, how the text and the context interact, whether there's been some insight that's led us to personal information, or whether indeed, and this of course we can't plan for, whether God has spoken somehow in that recontextualisation. So we haven't had the opportunity to talk with you about your thoughts, but we're going to put you in breakout groups, I believe, where you can discuss how the original text struck you, the text from Matthew, and those of you who know the text well might have noticed that I also put in there a little bit from Matthew 27 about the death of Judas, just to remind you, about that original text, and then about this contemporary text that we've used, the story of St. Nicholas's, and whether there's been any opportunity for a new insight through that reflection. Okay.
Thank you, Robyn. That's really interesting. And I think especially as we travel through Holy Week to reflect on this text in terms of listening, dialogue, performing and evaluating that process. James, I wonder whether you could send us off into breakout rooms. Now we'll have 10 minutes. Think about and talk about with the people in your breakout room, how is this text speaking to you today? And are there any questions or challenges that it raises for you that you want to bring back into conversation with Robyn and Teresa when we come back from breakout rooms? So introduce yourself to each other when you land in your breakout room. Say hello and good day, and then have a bit of a chat about what you've heard so far and what's speaking to you. Thanks, James. Oh, welcome back to the main room, everyone. I hope you've had a good conversation with your breakout groups. We're thinking about how the text is speaking to us today, and then further questions and challenges it might have raised for us. So I'll hand back to Teresa and Robyn to collect some of our ideas that we've had.
Thanks, Dan. So we've wanted to first start with the question that we thought about when we first heard the text. What does it feel like to be Judas? So we place ourselves in the context of the narrative. And often as practitioners, what we want to do is to say, this is really helpful. I'd like to use this in this context. Let's hold off going there for a moment and think about what it feels like to be in that space if we place ourselves into the story of the narrative. And maybe if we start by sharing some of that conversation that you had in the breakout, start by sharing that in the chat, and we'll pull up some of the themes that come through there. We might even call on some people to speak to that if we have some time there. Even if you begin by, maybe you're all busy typing for me, even if you begin by speaking about some of the themes or pop in the chat some of the themes that you talked about in your group. Yeah, it's a feeling of discomfort, Andrea, thank you. Thanks, Dan. I was interested in Patricia's response just before we went into breakout rooms. Hopefully you can all see that response there. Patricia, I might ask you to speak to that. Can you turn on your microphone and just talk for just a couple of seconds about that?
Yeah, sure. I work as a prison chaplain, so I was just in prison today and at one of the women's prisons, and the woman I was talking to, the prisoner was saying how she'd read the reading today. So she just said, I feel so much like Judas. And, you know, he'd made a mistake and I'd made a mistake, you know, but just knowing that, well, she feels that she knows, whereas perhaps Judas didn't, that God forgives her was really, really powerful. Yeah, especially, you know, coming up for Easter, we'll have a Good Friday. We'll have an Easter service on Good Friday, so it'd be nice to be able to go back and sort of just check in with her about that and just sort of speak about that forgiveness.
Yeah, thank you. Often Robyn and I make the point that it's quite important when we engage in recontextualisation to look at the reading of the day, because often what we can do is go to our tried and true texts and the ones that we kind of know really well and the ones we've worked through in our minds, and when we just go to the reading of the day, it often brings up a text that we would otherwise want to avoid. And that was my first thought when I saw that this was the reading for today. And I emailed Robyn and said, oh, I'm not sure, it's Judas. And she went, no, let's go with it. And your sharing just then, Patricia, just tells me exactly why it was important that we went with it today. So it's often things like that that just come up that you just really don't kind of expect to happen, you know? Yeah. Thank you for that. So in the chat, we've got that sense of feeling really uncomfortable to be in the place of Judas. How many of us have felt that space before, that real feeling of desolation? The sense of shame, identifying with someone who makes mistakes and the consequences. Jesus understood Judas and his frailty. Margaret, can you speak to that for a moment? Oh, just you're on mute.
Jesus and his frailty, and how did I feel about Jesus? I think it's a very potent ending to that reading today, where he went back to the Pharisees, threw the money down, and went out and hanged himself. And you can't help but think that he realised that he had made a monumental mistake, but it wasn't that he intended Jesus to be taken captive and to be condemned to death. And so he was overcome, I think, with remorse for what he had done. And I think that's something we can all identify with.
Indeed, thank you.
One of the interesting things to do this, and if I'd done it in the normal context that we do, which is much longer, I need to go and I need to read a lot of stuff that people have written about this text. And so when I was investigating all of these texts, predominantly there's been a view of Judas throughout history that that's the end of the line for him, that he's condemned eternally. And what I found about the contemporary reading that was one of the things that I stumbled over was the thought that Judas can be forgiven. And that was a very new kind of insight for me.
Can you say that again, Robyn? I missed it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When I was doing a lot of reading around this text, it seems as though the interpretations of Judas throughout history have overwhelmingly been negative, and that he's condemned. Like he condemns himself pretty much by hanging himself. He recognises that he's sinned in a way that's unforgivable. What really struck me about this window in the story and the way that that unfolded is that Judas too can be forgiven. That had never hit me before. So it's a bit like, you know, I Am Charlie, you know, Charlie Hebdo, I am Judas.
Mm.
Any other things people would like to share in the chat, or perhaps turn on your mic and share some of your thoughts?
I think, well, the other thing that I remember being told was that Judas had to betray Jesus. This was part of God's plan, was to have him betrayed by somebody who was close to him. And it's all that was always a problem, because I thought if you understood Jesus, then and what his message was, you wouldn't make that mistake. But I can see as you get older, even though, I mean, you can make a mistake because you think you understand, but you don't know the consequences of your mistake. And I think you're right that Jesus would have forgiven him, because he didn't say it out loud. He just acknowledged Judas. When Judas said, "Is it I?" he said, "You have said it." So that understanding was just between the two of them. He didn't hang him out to dry publicly, did he?
No.
No.
That's the other thread that comes through, is the way that people have tried to say, well, we had to have Judas because this is part of God's plan, which makes me want to say, what kind of a God has a plan in which, you know, some pawn has to betray Jesus?
They've gone down to basketball.
I think Patty had something to add too. Go ahead, Patty.
Yes, I was thinking the same. You know, Judas isn't a puppet in this. I mean, I found it interesting. I had never noticed the phrase before when he says, you know, well, how much will you give me if I do this? So he's negotiating in a sense. If they had said, well, one piece of silver, perhaps Judas wouldn't have come to the party. And I thought, you know, I like what you said, that, you know, I'm Charlie Hebdo, I am Judas, that do we all have our price for betrayal? And perhaps we do. Perhaps I do. You know, if the payback is high enough. So I think there's something really profound in this story, and your question, initial question, you know, how am I Judas, or what does it feel like to be Judas? And it shows you the wonder of the text, the resonance still today.
And what does it feel like? And I'm conscious in saying this, that this is should have a trigger warning. What does someone feel like that they're prepared to take their life?
Annie.
May I say something? I've been listening to everything, and those thoughts, like, you know, one way or another have crossed my mind at different things. What comes to my mind is, okay, he couldn't go back to his friends, to the rest of the other 12 after he betrayed Jesus, because there's no way he could go back and face them once he knew, like, oh, you know, Jesus was scourged and flogged and hanged and crucified and died. But was he not part of them, that nobody went looking for him afterwards? Was he an outsider? Was he never part of the 12, like, you know, really close to them? That nobody, not one of those 12 went looking for him and saying, come back? Because if they really took Jesus's teaching to heart, and they knew his message of, you know, you go to the outsider, it doesn't matter what they've done, and you have to show love, and this is how you do it. If they had taken that to heart, and if it was there, would they have gone to him? Would they have spoken to him? Would they have talked him down? Would they have comforted or consoled him? Would he have not then taken his own life?
Wow, that's amazing.
I've never thought of that at all.
Never, ever thought about the sheep who goes missing. Another another flavour that comes through in the readings is, so who's worse, Peter, who denies knowing Jesus, or Judas? And the authors talk about the ways in which all sign of Judas is really expunged from the Gospels. Not sure that the way of thinking about that is quite right, but there's only 4 mentions of Judas. So maybe there's a whole lot of other stories where he's actually part of the gang. But you really get this whole sense that he always has been and continues to be the outsider.
Kathy, I think I saw you raise your hand.
Well, yes, just responding to Annie's sharing. They were all scared silly. They weren't thinking of anyone but themselves. They all ran off. They were scared. They all ran off and hid. So I don't think they had any thought of what's going on with Judas. It would be what's going on with me. Because we know that it was Peter, that's where Peter denied Jesus in his fear. We know it was the women that stood by Jesus, didn't run off.
That's right. Andrea, is that your hand up?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Just a couple of things. I guess I want to be forgiven, and I want to offer and extend forgiveness. That's not always easy to do. There's some crimes or some sins that do seem unforgivable or whatever. So I wonder in our time, of course, about the scourge of sexual abuse and the capacity to forgive grave crimes or grave sins. Someone said to me recently that the reform movement, that it's a bit like that we are the anti-vaxxers of the church, like we are a group that's apart too, and it's like in our consciousness at the moment, it's okay to hate some people, like so we hate the anti-vaxxers. So, but we're all really part of a group that can be hated or is hard to love. Anyway, just questions, musings.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Let's now go to the meta question. How might we think about this process or use this process in the work that we do in ministry or teaching?
Recognising that what we've done is so tiny that it would be easy to, misunderstand.
Yeah, and I might actually just share the screen again with the slide on it. And Danielle, I'll throw to you.
While everyone's writing their questions or challenges in the chat, I might start off with a question, if you don't mind. I'm thinking about us as adults in different contexts, some of us teachers, some of us pastoral ministry. Why do you think it's important to engage anew with the scripture? What does it? Why is it important for the formation of an adult faith to recontextualize scripture and to do this sort of activity today?
How long have you got? Partly, or perhaps entirely, because often it's easy to think that Christianity is a faith of the past. It's a faith that's concerned with tradition, that people often think means that it's 2,000 years old and that we have to do everything identically to, well, often 50 years ago or 500 years ago. We think about revelation in the person of Christ as something that happens in the past. All of these things make it difficult to think about a living faith in the contemporary context, when the contemporary context is at the point where people's eyes glaze over if you talk about faith or religion or anything. Not because they're bored, just because they've got no idea what that means. And so when, if we're working with kids or indeed with adults, as the teachers that we do a lot of work with, it's useless if you're just teaching history. If it's not about something that's alive, about a revelation that you can encounter and bring into the tradition, which is ongoing, then you're not, no one's listening. So that recontextualisation depends on a really thorough knowledge of the tradition. And you would have seen that as people mention things, I was saying, oh, I heard about this. We would have done a whole lot of thinking about different points of view in the tradition. But it's actually about today. So it was about, and forgive me, it was Patricia, I think, who was talking about the person who was in prison. That's the tradition speaking. That's revelation, God revealing who God is in the present moment. And we do that not by imagining that the scripture is this sort of set of historical texts, but by the belief that God can speak to us anew in the texts and in ways that we don't expect and in ways that will touch loads of different people, not just Christian people or not just people who think they're part of the church. So to me, the point of doing this kind of work is to engage people in the now of faith and in the future of faith and allow God to speak.
The ongoing process of revelation, or as Teresa, as you would say, no doubt, God interrupting history in our form of thinking about the text, what it means for us today. Awesome.
Indeed.
Andrea mentions in the chat that it's a great process to use in preaching. I know we've had around 60 women over the last just over a year preach on Australian Women Preach, and I think lots of them use a similar sort of process when they're engaging with the scripture for their preaching. Do you have any reflections on why you think this process or how it has an impact on formation of faith, or what value you can see in terms of preaching in that context?
I might start and then I'll throw to you, Robyn. The key element of this for me is to also actually engage in dialogue with the tradition, because often what happens is we discount, when we think of engaging in scripture, often we assume our particular understandings of texts. We don't revisit the assumptions that we make about the text. We don't revisit the way the text has been interpreted in history. And the part of this process, which is dialoguing with the tradition, with the post-biblical tradition, sometimes raises questions for us about the ways that the texts have been understood in history, and sometimes kind of interrupts some of the narratives that have been harmful and some of the understandings that have not been helpful for our thinking about the way the text might speak to us in today's context. And that's particularly important, I think, with texts like, the second creation narrative, with the creation of Eve, particularly important with texts like Cain and Abel, the texts that we find particularly difficult. And this text of the story of Judas, and the way that the text has been interpreted in history sometimes shuts down the possibility of the text speaking to us today. So that's a really important part of the process for me. And that's often something that the teachers, when we're engaging this in the process that Robyn and I use in our teaching, that's often something that is really striking for the teachers that we encounter this with, and it often opens up a whole range of new possibilities for them in terms of thinking about the way the text speaks to them today. Robyn, would you add anything to that?
Only to say that it's very difficult in the context of preaching, like tonight, there's so little time that the different elements of the process don't really have time to become clear. So it's not sort of just reading a text and then, doing an activity, but it's this engagement. So I guess in terms of preaching, the most important thing for me would be giving people the opportunity to hear the text itself in a new way, because someone gets up to read, and I don't know about you, perhaps you're better than me, but often I'm just like, oh yeah, and I don't even listen. Or I listen in a way that, I've heard that text a million times. And this week, particularly, long readings. Very easy to just float off and away and think that we know what the reading says. So that I guess in preaching, if we can enable the text to speak, I think we do people a service.
Thanks, Robyn. That's really interesting, isn't it? How we can just glaze over when those texts come up. Someone had their hand up. I think it might have been Margaret in the chat. I don't know if that was from earlier or if you had another question.
Yes, I did have my hand up, and I got involved in the conversation, so I virtually forgot what I was saying. But and just reflecting on what has just been said recently, as a Catholic woman of over 70 years and listened to scriptures read every Sunday at Mass, yes, there's been a lot of just flowing over the top. But in the last 10 years or so, when there have been so many scripture scholars, particularly women, scripture scholars reinterpreting the scriptures for us, now you tend to listen with different ears and hear a different story. And so, like, there are lots of examples, but I won't take up time on this session here. But things, but things that we've never really thought about, well, I'll give you one example so you know what I'm saying, is the agony in the garden and all that Jesus went through during that agony in the garden. However, all the scriptures, the synoptic gospels, have the apostles asleep. And we've never asked the question, if they're all asleep, who actually witnessed the agony in the garden? Because there was no time for Jesus to give an interview for the 7 o'clock news. He must have been observed by somebody. And so the case could be made that who would have observed him, and it was probably his mother or Mary Magdalene. But quite clearly, all the apostles were asleep. And I mean, must have been very embarrassing for those gospel writers to say they were all asleep. And 3 times they're asleep. It's not just once, it's 3 times. But getting back to my original point, how I've listened to that all my life and never really thought about, okay, who did witness the agony in the garden? Because there are a lot of features of that agony in the garden. Probably half a dozen things that have been noted in the scriptures that happened with Jesus during that agony.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm sorry, in the interest of time, I'm just going to cut that to give Teresa and Robyn the final word.
Thank
you. I might just bring in also the question in the chat, thinking about how we do find contemporary texts. You know, we're talking about how we look at, how we bring in different voices and different wisdom. And we talked a bit about looking at women's voices or different forms of inclusion. I wonder if you would just like to speak to that just before we conclude.
When I'm looking for contemporary text, I'm often looking at text that bears no relation to the Bible explicitly. But, for example, we do a recontextualization of the woman with the hemorrhage. And believe it or not, we get to the point where we start looking at those ads that were, I don't know, not so long ago, where women were trying to say having your period is okay. There's a whole lot of complications there that, you know, it's not a straight line from the woman with the hemorrhage to women having their period. But invariably what seems to happen is when you read a text, it speaks to something in the context. And if you're listening to the context, then things just sort of seem to pop up.
But I just say one of those things that you're referring to there would be why women cannot be on the altar, because they menstruate and they're condemned to be dirty. So
we trace that through history to get there.
And sometimes recontextualization can't be as simple as finding someone who has already recontextualized the text for themselves. You know, something I heard you talking through, Margaret, was, you know, when you find contemporary understandings, it helps you see the text differently. But actually, sometimes it's just a matter of placing the text into dialogue with a contemporary issue and looking at how the text speaks to that issue and how the issue might interrupt particular understandings of that scripture passage that we hold dear, that we kind of don't want to unsettle. you know, and what happens in that process is the process of recontextualization.
That's really great, Teresa. I love that as well. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up this session, but we've had such great questions and challenges and wisdom. So I'd like to thank Robyn and Teresa for sharing their wisdom with us today. We're really blessed to have you with us. Thank you for coming along. Thank you to the WATAC team who supported this month's WATAC Presents, and to James for our technical support. You're all welcome to join us in May for WATAC in Dialogue, our community building session where we just get together and have a sort of more informal conversation as a WATAC group. And on the third Wednesday of the following month, WATAC Presents in June. So don't miss Mary Colo preaching for Easter Sunday and this week's Australian Women Preach. And Joan Chittister is also touring Australia through Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. You can jump on, book your tickets online. Don't miss out. That's going to be awesome. Thank you for joining WATAC Presents tonight. There'll be a few WATAC members. Stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to stick around and say hi. But thanks for coming and have a lovely night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.